Hi guys, hello, it is Miss Sailor here with part 1 of the second half, I guess you could say part 3, of First American Civilizations. So we're going to talk about the Aztecs and the Incas and some tribes within the North America instead of Mesoamerica. So, when the Spaniard Cortez arrives along the coast of Mexico in the 16th century, he hears of this great city ruled by this emperor. It's tremendously wealthy. It's filled with gold. The riches and complexity that Cortez finds when he arrives at this city is far beyond anything his men had ever seen before. According to legend, a warlike people called the Aztecs or Mexicas had left a city and traveled south to present-day Mexico City. And in 1325, they began construction called Tenochtitlan, which obviously my pronunciation might be incorrect. They began the construction on an island in Lake Texcoco. By 1519, when Cortez actually arrives, the settlement had contained an upward of 200,000 inhabitants. It was certainly the largest city in the Western Hemisphere at the time, and probably larger than any European city at the time. It was well planned. It was very clean and orderly compared to European cities. It was situated in neighborhoods by occupation, which was a very different approach. They actually had trash collection, which if you think about what was going on at the same time in the 1500s when Cortez arrives, while there was sewer systems, because the Romans would have built the sewer systems, European countries, especially cities, were notoriously gross and notoriously disgusting. They did not have a trash pickup. You literally just flung it out the window onto the street like you mostly see in Hollywood movies. There were markets and aqueducts that brought in fresh water. The Aztecs themselves bathed daily, unlike the Spanish, who did not. And wealthy homes sometimes had steam baths, like actual steam baths in these homes. And this was in the Western Hemisphere, which is so crazy to think about, because a lot of times there's the association of being not as advanced as it would have been with Europe. They had a labor force of slaves from subjugated neighboring tribes. And then they had 3 major causeways that connected it to the mainland. So to farm, the Aztecs actually constructed barges of reeds, and they filled them with soil. These are called floating gardens. I'm not going to try and say the Spanish name. They were constantly irrigated with lake water. You can actually still see them. There are neighborhoods in Mexico City that still practice this irrigation of floating gardens. Like the rest in Mesoamerica, the Aztec Mexica were polytheistic. Their pantheon, they had a god that ruled they had one that ruled all aspects of the natural world, such as the heavens, farming, rain, fertility, sacrifice, and even combat. They had a ruling class of warrior nobles and priests who typically performed ritual human sacrifice daily to sustain the sun on its journey across the sky, which is pretty crazy to think about. This is the one that you've seen. I'm going to assume maybe you watched the movie or you've seen it in Tomb Raider. It's the one where they're cutting the chest open and they're removing the heart. As you can see, this is an example of what they would have done. This is just artistic interpretation of what they were doing to them. So, you don't just have the Aztecs. You also have the Incas that are going on right at this time. So in South America, they are the most highly developed and complex society at that time. At its height in the 15th and 16th centuries, their empire was located on the Pacific Ocean, straddling the Andes Mountains, into modern-day Colombia and north into Chile. North into Colombia and to Chile in the south. It had a road system, kept free of debris, repaired consistently by workers at varying intervals. It rivaled the Roman road system, and it connected their empire. They didn't use axe-mounted wheels for transportation. They actually built roads to ascend and descend the slopes of the Andes. It worked well for pedestrians, so walking and running. Very sufficient in movement of their armies from place to place. They had runners who traversed the roads in a continuous relay system, ensuring quick communication over long distances. They had no system of writing, though. They communicated and kept records through string cords like these. It was a system of colored strings and knots that they used to communicate, and that was their form of written language. They worshiped their lord, who, as a member of the elite ruling class, had absolute authority over every aspect of life. Their diet mostly consisted of corn, beans, squash, and they had an indigenous potato. But peasants only received 1/3 of their crops for themselves. The ruler required 1/3, and then 1/3 was set aside as a form of welfare for people who could not work. They worshipped a sun god. And called gold the sweat of the sun. Unlike the Mayas and the Aztec, they rarely practiced human sacrifice, though. They typically offered their gods food and clothing, things like that. It was only in dire situations, like things that would make you think of the apocalypse, that is when they would actually resort to sacrificing prisoners, or more specifically, children. But it wasn't typical. So, you also have Machu Picchu, which was uncovered in 1911 by the historian Hiram Bingham. The city had been built in 1450 and inexplicably abandoned roughly 100 years later. It's located in Peru. Scholars believe, though, that the city was used for religious ceremony purposes and housed priesthood, but they don't know for sure. So that is the Aztecs and the Incas, and I'm going to stop this part, and I'll do a next one that will be about North American native cultures and tribes.